my lords. As a group of amendments, this group actually covers a range of different issues, all under the heading of accountability and transparency. So I just want to say something generally on that, which is I think we have to concede that the public, for good reason, are pretty cynical about prison policy at the moment and are suspicious of changes in sentencing. There's all sorts of controversies that have arisen around both of those things. A lot of us spoke to these issues at second reading. So one of the ways that I think this bill, for it not to simply become part of that cynicism, is that I think that we need to ensure that the decisions made in relation to this legislation are as open to public scrutiny as possible. And in that spirit, I particularly support the Noble Lord Jackson's 93A, which is a report on the efficacy of reforms in relation to community sentences and suspended prison sentences, suspended orders and so on. In some of the discussions that we've had, it's as though we're having a conversation that if we increase the number of suspended sentences so that, and community sentences, that reoffending rates will simply go down because people will be in the community, there'll be rehabilitation everywhere, crimes being committed, that somehow prison is blamed intrinsically for making people in prison absolutely guaranteed to carry on offending when they leave prison. That's a kind of one description that we heard from a number of noble lords at second reading. My concern is that we sometimes might fool ourselves about a rehabilitative utopia about the community. And I used an analogy in second reading about mental health care. Of course, if you posit the situation of locking people up in psychiatric hospitals and then pose that and say, how would they possibly get well? We should have much more community provision. I would often agree with you. The problem is that if actually you release people from those hospitals into the community without provision, then actually that is a disaster both for everybody, both for innocent victims in some instances and also in that instance for patients. So my worry is that really worthy aims associated with this bill will not be able to be delivered because of a lack of facility or resources in the community. And I am also concerned that despite the undoubtedly honourable and genuine and sincere intentions of the Noble Lord the Minister in this House, actually the arguments in relation to justifying this piece of legislation have been much more pragmatic and utilitarian elsewhere from the rest of the government, which is effectively to say we have to review sentencing, we have to do all of these things because our jails are too full, which is not the same as having any kind of principled commitment to improve things. And so at the very least, I think we owe it to the British public to check what happens once this bill comes into action. And that's why, and whether actually it is delivering its efficacy is incredibly important, because if it doesn't work, then actually it's people in the community that are going to suffer. And so I think that Amendment 93A is crucial. I also wanted to absolutely support the noble Baroness Neville Rolfe in her 93B, as much as anything, because one of the reasons why we say prison doesn't work and why actually people argue there's a problem with prison is precisely because actually the purposeful activity, or in fact just using prison in a way that could be constructive whilst being a punishment, but also being used to ensure that prisoners are in fact have access to training, work and education and so on, is just not being delivered at the moment. It's just you know, you can say it's happening, it is just not happening. The Noble Lord the Minister knows that I'm involved in one project called Debating Matters Beyond Bars, which is debating competitions in prisons. And one of the things which the prisoners often say when they're involved in these is it's really good to have the opportunity to have a bit of pugilism that's intellectual rather than fisticuffs. And that actually just having something to think about, to talk about, to debate and discuss, that is kind of education too. But it is absolutely excruciating trying to get those kind of projects off the ground in prisons because there just are not the resources. The number of prisoners that I've met over the years who've been enthusiastic about doing some kind of educational training but not able to access it in prisons simply fuels this notion that prisons are not working, that they become absolutely seething morasses of frustration, and that can't be good for anyone. So I would like to make them mandatory as well. It's kind of quite difficult because that's not entirely to do with accountability, except that in some ways, if we could actually see accountability and transparency about what's actually happening in relation to education and training in prison, I think it would inform, rather than it just being sort of broadly mentioned, I think it would inform the broader debate. And then just finally, there is one amendment that I'm absolutely not sure on, and that's the Noble Lord, Lord Jackson's 127, enabling public scrutiny of parole board proceedings. Now, I watched the BBC series on parole. I watched every one of them, absolutely fascinating insights. I actually think that parole hearings and parole boards and so on, and what happens in relation to parole are crucial and key. My concern is, and I know the Noble Lord has included in reference to objections from victims and families and legal representatives, is the notion that everything should always be open. Now, I've argued for political transparency and accountability, that's fine, but there are things that the Parole Board does that I think might require discretion and some privacy. And one of the things that I've had drawn to my attention is that, for example, it might well be that Parole Board members of staff might want to say about a particular prisoner, you should not let them out. You know, off the record, I want to say this to you about this prisoner. And I don't necessarily want that being made widely available. So I think it's just more complicated than just saying open up the Parole Board. That's what my reservations are. I also have to say that the Parole Board itself, though, or the whole parole system, really does require some careful scrutiny, because I do feel that the frustrations of prisoners, their families and victims very often centre on what happens at parole hearings. I mean, if you actually talk, as people will know about IPP prisoners, their whole fate, their whole rests on what happens at parole board hearings. And the frustration of people not feeling that they're given a fair hearing and then not having access or being able to make public what happens, I understand. But I think it just is not a black and white issue, and therefore I'm uncertain about that particular amendment.